A widow, a dead garden, a silent child with bandaged arms. One seed and something no one expected bloomed. The silence in Margaret Vance's small house wasn't peaceful. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of things left unsaid, of grief turned inwards until it calcified. It pressed down from the low ceilings, seeped from the faded floral wallpaper, and settled thickest in the space where her husband, Colonel Robert Vance, used to sit reading the evening paper. That space by the cold hearth remained empty, a constant aching void. Outside, the late summer sun beat down on the parched earth of what had once been a garden. Now, it was a testament to neglect, a mirror of the barren landscape within Margaret herself. Brittle brown stalks clawed at the air where roses and peonies once bloomed. Weeds choked the life out of forgotten herbs. The soil, cracked and gray, looked like old scars on the face of the land. It hadn't been touched, truly touched, since Robert's flag-draped coffin had been lowered into the ground 2 years prior. 2 years, or a lifetime. Sometimes Margaret couldn't tell the difference. She moved through the house like a ghost haunting her own life. A woman in her late 50s, though the lines etched around her pale blue eyes and the silver threads, dominating her once dark hair, spoke of more years or harder ones. Her frame was thin, almost brittle, swallowed by the practical, shapeless clothes she wore. Once she had been a nurse, tending soldiers stateside during Robert's deployments. She'd seen trauma, understood its insidious ways, but understanding offered no shield when the blow landed on her own heart. Robert hadn't fallen in combat. He'd come home, decorated and lauded, only to be taken by a sudden, vicious illness that medicine couldn't fight. A cruel irony that left Margaret adrift, the anchor of her life abruptly gone. The silence he left behind was louder than any battlefield roar she'd ever imagined. Her days followed a numb routine. Wake, coffee, stare out the window at the dead garden, force down some toast, tidy rooms that never got messy, wait for the sun to set. Sleep rarely offered escape, often bringing fragmented dreams of field hospitals, medals glinting under harsh lights, and Robert's fading smile. She lived on the outskirts of a small town nestled in the foothills, a place where American flags flew proudly from porches, and military service was a thread woven deep into the community fabric. People were kind, initially. Casseroles appeared on her doorstep. Sympathetic murmurs followed her at the grocery store. But grief, especially the silent, unyielding kind, makes people uncomfortable. Gradually, the visits lessened. The calls stopped. Margaret didn't blame them. She offered nothing back, trapped in her own desolate landscape. Her only regular visitor was the red-tailed hawk. It would circle high above the neglected fields behind her house, a solitary figure against the vast, indifferent sky. Sometimes it would perch on the skeletal branches of the old maple at the edge of the property, its keen eyes surveying the world below. Margaret watched it, feeling a strange kinship with its fierce solitude. It asked for nothing, offered nothing, but its wild, untamed presence, a silent witness to her stagnation. One afternoon, as Margaret stood listlessly by the kitchen window, washing a single plate, a flicker of movement caught her eye. Near the broken gate that led to the dead garden stood a child, a small girl, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, thin and hesitant, like a startled fawn poised for flight. Margaret frowned. Children rarely came this far out. The girl wore a faded, oversized dress, and her arms were wrapped in dirty-looking gauze bandages from wrist to elbow. Even from the distance, Margaret could see the unnatural stiffness, the way the girl held them slightly away from her body. The girl just stood there, watching the house with large, dark, unreadable eyes. There was an old soul's wariness in her gaze that didn't belong on such a young face. Margaret felt a prickle of unease, mixed with a faint, long, dormant stirring of her nurse's instinct. She dried her hands slowly, watching the child. The girl didn't move, didn't make a sound, just watched. Margaret opened the back door, the hinges groaning in protest. "Hello?" Margaret called out, her voice rusty from disuse. "Are you lost?" The girl flinched at the sound, taking a small step back, but she didn't run. She just shook her head, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. Her eyes remained fixed on Margaret. "Are you all right?" Margaret tried again, keeping her voice soft. "Those arms. Are you hurt?" The girl looked down at her bandaged arms, then quickly back up, her expression unchanging. She offered no reply, no sound. Silence stretched between them, thick and awkward. Margaret felt a familiar wave of weariness wash over her. Another person needing something she didn't have the energy to give. She started to turn back inside, to retreat to her safe, numb world. But then the girl moved. Slowly, cautiously, she reached into a pocket hidden in the folds of her dress. Her bandaged hand emerged, clutching something small. She took a hesitant step forward, then another, stopping a few feet from the porch steps. With deliberate care, she opened her hand. Resting in her palm, stark against the grubby gauze, was a single, dark seed. It looked like a sunflower seed, perhaps, or something similar. Sturdy, unassuming, holding the promise of life within its shell. The girl held it out towards Margaret, not demanding, just offering. Her dark eyes, for the first time, held a flicker of something other than fear. A quiet plea, perhaps. An invitation? Margaret stared at the seed, then at the girl's silent, waiting face. Why? Why here? Why now? High above, the red-tailed hawk let out a sharp, piercing cry as it circled lazily against the pale blue sky. The sound seemed to break the spell. Margaret found herself walking down the steps, drawn by an impulse she didn't understand. She stopped in front of the child, close enough now to see the faint tracing of older scars peeking from beneath the edge of the gauze near her wrists, close enough to see the profound, unnerving silence in her eyes. She looked down at the offered seed again, a tiny speck of potential life offered in the midst of her carefully cultivated desolation. It felt significant. Absurd, yet significant. Slowly, almost reluctantly, Margaret held out her own hand. The girl carefully tipped the seed into Margaret's palm. Their fingers didn't touch, but a strange current seemed to pass between them in the small space separating their hands. As soon as the seed was transferred, the girl stepped back, her wariness returning. She gave Margaret one last long look, then turned and walked away, disappearing back down the dusty track the way she had come, as silently as she had appeared. Margaret stood frozen, the small dark seed resting heavy in her palm. The silence the girl left behind felt different. Now, not empty but questioning. She looked at the seed, then at the dead garden, a wasteland of brittle stalks and cracked earth. Plant it? Here? It was madness. Nothing had grown there for 2 years. The soil felt dead, poisoned by neglect and grief. She closed her hand around the seed, its hardness pressing against her skin. Felt the faint warmth it seemed to hold, a tiny spark of defiance against the overwhelming emptiness. She walked towards the garden gate, the broken wood groaning as she pushed it open, stepped onto the barren ground. The dust rose around her worn shoes. She looked for a spot, any spot that didn't seem utterly hopeless. Near the center, where a bird bath lay overturned and cracked, there was a patch where the morning sun lingered longest. The earth looked marginally less hostile there. Using the heel of her shoe, Margaret scraped away the driest top layer, revealing slightly darker soil beneath. She knelt, her knees protesting, and dug a small hole with her bare fingers. The earth felt cool, resistant. She placed the seed inside, covered it gently, patted the soil down. It felt like a futile gesture, a prayer whispered into a void. She stood up, brushing the dirt from her hands, looked at the small, disturbed patch of earth. Nothing marked it save for her action. Why had she done that? For the strange, silent girl? For the memory of Robert, who had loved this garden? Or for some forgotten part of herself that still clung stubbornly to the idea of life? She didn't know. She only knew that the seed was there now, hidden in the dead earth, holding its secret promise. She turned back towards the house, the silence settling around her once more. But this time it felt different. Less absolute, tinged with the faintest, most fragile whisper of possibility. High overhead, the hawk continued its patient circling, a silent guardian watching over the woman, the dead garden, and the single buried seed. The girl, Margaret began to think of her tentatively as Sarah, though she had no basis for the name other than a whisper of intuition, became a sporadic, silent presence at the edge of the dead garden. She never announced her arrival, simply appearing near the broken gate like a woodland creature testing the safety of a clearing. Sometimes days would pass between visits, leaving Margaret to wonder if the strange connection had dissolved as silently as it had formed. Then, Sarah would be there again, her dark eyes watching, waiting. Their interactions revolved almost entirely around the small patch of disturbed earth where the seed lay buried. Sarah would arrive, point towards the watering can, and together, in silence, they would perform the ritual. Margaret filling the can, Sarah carefully watering the spot. It was a shared task, a fragile thread connecting their two solitudes. Margaret found herself clearing the immediate area around the seed's resting place, pulling up the brittle skeletons of long-dead weeds, loosening the compacted soil with a rusty hand trowel she found in the shed. Her movements were stiff at first, her muscles protesting the unaccustomed labor. Grief had made her sedentary, shrinking her world to the four walls of the house. Now, the simple act of kneeling on the earth, digging her fingers into the soil, felt both foreign and strangely grounding. Sarah would watch her work, sometimes mimicking Margaret's actions by pulling at smaller weeds nearby, her bandaged hands moving with surprising dexterity despite their coverings. She never spoke, but her presence was a quiet encouragement, a shared investment in their unlikely project. Weeks passed. The late summer heat lingered, broken only by occasional thunderstorms that swept through the valley, washing the dust from the air but doing little to revive the desolate garden. Margaret continued the watering ritual, sometimes alone, sometimes with Sarah as her silent partner. Doubt gnawed at her. It was foolishness, a single seed given by a strange child, planted in barren ground. What hope did it really have? One sweltering afternoon, frustration boiled over. She stood staring at the patch of earth, unchanged, lifeless. The effort felt pointless, a waste of precious water and dwindling emotional energy. She felt the familiar numbness creeping back, the urge to retreat, to shut the door on this fragile, demanding connection. She turned away abruptly, intending to abandon the ritual. As she did, a shadow passed overhead. The red-tailed hawk soared low, its sharp cry echoing in the still air. It circled the dead garden once, twice, then banked sharply and flew towards the distant woods. Margaret stopped, watching it go. The hawk's presence, so wild and free, seemed a rebuke to her own despair. It survived. It endured. It watched. Over this land, dead or alive. She looked back at the patch of earth. Sarah was standing near the gate, watching her, her small face unusually expressive. Was it disappointment Margaret saw in those dark eyes? Or just a reflection of her own? Taking a deep breath, Margaret picked up the watering can again. She walked back to the spot and watered the earth, the simple, repetitive action calming her agitation. Sarah approached slowly and stood beside her, watching the water sink into the soil. In that shared moment of renewed commitment, Margaret felt the fragile connection between them strengthen, a silent acknowledgement passing through the space as the days shortened and the first hints of autumn tinged the air. Margaret found herself spending more time outside, not just watering the seed, but tentatively exploring the rest of the neglected garden. She pulled away dead vines clinging to the trellis where Robert's climbing roses used to flourish. She cleared fallen leaves and debris from the cracked bird bath. Small acts of reclamation, performed without conscious decision. Sarah sometimes joined her, her silence a comfortable counterpoint to Margaret's own quiet labor. The girl seemed fascinated by insects, by the patterns on leaves, by the way sunlight filtered through the branches of the old maple. She would point things out to Margaret with a small, bandaged finger, her eyes wide with discovery. Margaret found herself responding, naming the bird calls she recognized, pointing out the difference between oak and maple leaves, sharing fragments of knowledge she hadn't realized she still possessed. Their communication remained nonverbal, a language built of gestures, shared glances, and mutual observation. Margaret learned to read the subtle shifts in Sarah's posture, the tension in her small shoulders, the fleeting emotions that crossed her face like shadows. Fear was a constant undercurrent, but moments of curiosity, concentration, and even a rare ghost of a smile began to emerge. Margaret never asked about the bandages, about the silence, about where Sarah came from, or where she went when she disappeared. Instinct told her that pushing would break the fragile trust they were building. Healing, like gardening, required patience. You couldn't force a seed to sprout before its time. One crisp morning, Margaret knelt by the patch, trowel in hand, preparing to water, and then she saw it. Pushing through the dark soil, almost imperceptible, were two tiny pale green leaves, cotyledons, unfurling tentatively towards the sunlight. The seed had sprouted. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She stared, hardly daring to believe. After weeks of doubt of tending barren earth, life had emerged. Small, fragile, but undeniably there. A wave of emotion washed over her, so potent it made her dizzy. It wasn't joy, exactly, but a profound sense of awe, of relief, of something long frozen within her beginning to thaw. She looked around instinctively for Sarah, wanting to share the discovery, but the girl wasn't there. Margaret touched one of the tiny leaves with the tip of her finger, marveling at its delicate strength. Life finds a way. Even here, even now. When Sarah appeared later that day, Margaret led her silently to the spot. She knelt down, pointing. Sarah peered closely, her eyes widening. She reached out a bandaged finger, mirroring Margaret's earlier gesture, gently touching the tiny sprout. A sound escaped the girl's lips. Not a word, but a soft gasp, a breath of wonder. It was the first sound Margaret had ever heard her make. Sarah looked up at Margaret, her eyes shining with an emotion so pure, so unguarded, it pierced Margaret's reserve. In that shared moment of wonder over two tiny leaves, the distance between them seemed to vanish. The sprout grew slowly, hesitantly, but with undeniable persistence. It sent down roots into the reluctant soil, put forth more leaves, began to form a slender stalk. Margaret and Sarah became its devoted guardians. They protected it from harsh winds, ensured it got enough water, cleared away any encroaching weeds. With meticulous care, Margaret found herself researching gardening books from Robert's collection, relearning forgotten knowledge about soil, sunlight, and pests. She brought compost from the neglected bin behind the shed, enriching the earth around the small plant. Working the soil became less of a chore and more of a meditation, a way of reconnecting with the rhythms of life she had shut out. She learned more about Sarah through observation. The girl was resourceful, quick to learn by watching. She had a deep affinity for nature, a gentle way with small creatures. Margaret once saw her carefully rescuing an earthworm from the path and placing it back in the damp soil. But the fear never completely left her eyes, and she remained intensely protective of her bandaged arms, flinching if Margaret accidentally brushed against them. One afternoon, while they were weeding near the sprout, the red-tailed hawk landed on the branch of the nearby maple. It sat preening its feathers, seemingly oblivious to them, yet its presence felt significant. Sarah stopped her work, watching the hawk with rapt attention. She tilted her head, mimicking its sharp movements. Margaret watched the girl watching the bird, sensing a silent communication passing between them, a shared understanding of wildness, survival, and perhaps of wounds. The hawk eventually launched itself back into the sky, its powerful wings beating against the air. Sarah followed its flight until it was a speck in the distance. She then turned back to the small plant, her expression thoughtful, almost serene. Margaret realized the garden, the plant, their silent rituals, were creating a sanctuary. A safe space where two wounded souls could begin to tentatively heal, shielded from the demands and judgments of the outside world. But the outside world couldn't be kept at bay forever. Margaret knew the girl must have come from somewhere. Someone must be missing her, or perhaps someone was the source of her fear, her scars. The responsibility of the girl's presence weighed on Margaret, a counterpoint to the growing affection she felt. She also wrestled with her own past. Working the garden unearthed memories, Robert laughing as he planted tomatoes, the scent of lilies on their anniversary, the shared dreams for their future that now lay buried like dormant seeds. The pain was still sharp, but it was changing. Less numb despair, more poignant ache. She started talking to Robert sometimes, quiet conversations while pulling weeds or watering the sprout, sharing the small events of her day, the mystery of the silent girl. One evening, looking through Robert's things, she found his old service medals tucked away in a drawer. Polished bronze, worn ribbons, symbols of honor, sacrifice, loyalty, values he had lived by. She held them in her hand, feeling their weight. Had she been loyal to his memory by retreating into silence? Had she honored his sacrifice by letting his garden, his legacy of finding joy in simple things, wither? The sprout in the garden grew taller, stronger. It was clearly a sunflower, its stalk reaching determinedly towards the light. It seemed to draw strength from the very air, a testament to resilience. Margaret felt a parallel growth within herself, a hesitant unfurling. The numbness was receding, replaced by a complex tapestry of grief, curiosity, responsibility, and a fragile budding hope. A hope nurtured by shared silence, patient work, and the unexpected gift of a single seed from a scarred, silent child. The development phase was fraught with challenges, internal and external. The garden was still mostly dead. Margaret's grief was still profound. Sarah's past remained a mystery shrouded in silence and fear. But life, however small, had taken root. Trust, however fragile, was being built. And under the watchful eye of the hawk, in the quiet space between two lonely souls, something essential was beginning to grow. Autumn arrived in earnest, painting the distant hills in hues of rust and gold, but bringing with it a restless, unpredictable energy. The air grew colder, carrying the sharp scent of wood smoke and decaying leaves. The winds turned sharper, rattling the window panes and whispering through the eaves of Margaret's lonely house. The single sunflower, now standing tall and proud in its small patch of cultivated earth, seemed like a defiant beacon against the encroaching decay of the season and the lingering death of the surrounding garden. Its face, a vibrant disc crowned with brilliant yellow petals, now held the promise of countless seeds within its darkening center. It turned faithfully towards the weakening sun each day, a steadfast soldier of light. Margaret and Sarah's routine continued, their silent companionship deepening with each shared task, each quiet hour spent in the garden's evolving landscape. Margaret had cleared more of the surrounding beds, exposing the gnarled forms of dormant rose bushes, and uncovering the faint outlines of forgotten flower beds where Robert had once experimented with irises and daylilies. It was slow, arduous work, her body often aching afterwards, but each small victory against the years of neglect felt significant, a reclaiming not just of the land, but of herself. Sarah, increasingly comfortable in the sanctuary they had created, would sometimes trace intricate patterns in the dirt with a stick, or collect fallen leaves, fiery maples, sturdy oaks, delicate birches, arranging them in beautiful, transient mosaics on the flagstone path. The fear in Sarah's eyes hadn't vanished entirely. It lurked in the shadows, ready to spring at sudden noises or unexpected movements. But it retreated more often now, replaced by moments of quiet absorption. In the natural world, a focused intensity as she watched a spider spin its web or a beetle navigate a blade of grass. Her silence remained, a wall built of unknown trauma. But her gestures became more expressive, her presence less tentative. Yet, an undercurrent of tension remained, a low hum beneath the surface of their quiet days. The unspoken questions about Zira's past, her scars hidden beneath the now cleaner bandages Margaret helped her change. Her absolute silence hung in the air. Margaret occasionally saw the old, battered pickup truck drive slowly past her property again, the unseen driver peering towards the house. Each time, Sarah would invariably stiffen, her small body going rigid, her eyes darting towards the woods, as if mapping an escape route. Margaret felt a protective instinct rise within her, fierce and unfamiliar, a lioness guarding a wounded cub. But alongside it grew a gnawing unease. Who was looking for this child? And why did their presence evoke such profound terror? One afternoon, the sky turned a malevolent shade of bruised purple and gunmetal gray. The air grew heavy, charged with electricity. The wind picked up suddenly, whipping through the skeletal branches of the trees with a mournful howl, carrying the metallic scent of rain and ozone. The weather forecast, crackling over the old radio in the kitchen, had predicted a severe thunderstorm, the kind that could spawn damaging winds and hail, ripping through the valley with little warning. Margaret's first thought, immediate and sharp, was for the sunflower. It stood tall, nearly 5 feet now, a solitary sentinel. But its single stalk, though sturdy, looked terribly vulnerable against the rising gale. Its bright head, heavy, with seeds, bobbed precariously in the violent wind. "We need to protect it," Margaret murmured, the words snatched away by the wind. She spoke more to herself, to the memory of Robert's careful preparations before every storm, than to Sarah, who stood beside her near the porch, her small hand gripping the railing, watching the churning sky with wide, apprehensive eyes. Margaret hurried to the shed, the wind tugging at her clothes. She fumbled through the familiar clutter, rakes, shovels, old clay pots, searching for sturdy stakes and twine. Robert had always been meticulous about securing the taller plants, the dahlias, the delphiniums, before a storm hit. Finding what she needed, thick wooden stakes, a ball of weathered garden twine. She returned to the garden just as the first fat drops of rain began to fall, splattering against the dry earth like dark accusations. Sarah followed her, her small face pale, her eyes fixed on the menacing sky. As Margaret knelt, positioning the first stake beside the sunflower's stalk, the wind tore at her hair, whipping strands across her face, blinding her momentarily. The task was awkward. The ground, though softened by their recent efforts and the first drops of rain, was still resistant in places, clinging to its barrenness. Suddenly, a deafening clap of thunder cracked directly overhead, an explosive sound that seemed to shake the very ground beneath them. Sarah cried out, a sharp, high-pitched shriek of pure terror, utterly unlike the soft gasp of wonder Margaret had heard before. The girl stumbled back, clapping her bandaged hands over her ears, her body trembling violently. Her eyes were squeezed shut, her face contorted in an agony that went beyond fear of the storm. Margaret immediately abandoned the stake, her heart clenching with alarm. "Sarah, it's all right. It's just thunder," she called out, her voice nearly lost in the rising wind, moving quickly towards the terrified child. But Sarah seemed lost in a private hell, unresponsive to Margaret's voice. She sank to the wet ground, curling into a tight ball, her bandaged arms wrapped protectively around her head. Her small frame shook uncontrollably, buffeted by internal and external storms. Margaret knelt beside her, a wave of helplessness washing over her. Touch felt like a violation of the girl's carefully guarded space, especially now when she was so obviously lost in trauma. "Sarah, look at me," she pleaded softly, trying to project calm she didn't feel. "It's just a storm. We're safe here, nothing can hurt you here." The rain began to fall in earnest now, cold and driving, plastering Margaret's thin shirt to her skin. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, ripping leaves from the trees and sending them swirling through the air. Margaret glanced desperately back at the sunflower. Its bright head whipped back and forth violently, the stalk bent at an alarming angle. It wouldn't survive this without support. Then, another sound pierced the storm's fury. the unmistakable rumble of a vehicle engine, slowing down, tires crunching on the gravel shoulder of the road near her property line. Margaret's heart lurched. The battered pickup truck? Or something worse? Sarah heard it too, even through her terror. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with a panic that seemed even deeper, more primal than her fear of the thunder. She scrambled backwards on the muddy ground, away from the road, crab-walking towards the relative shelter of the old maple tree at the garden's edge, her movements frantic, desperate. Margaret's protective instinct surged, hot and fierce, overriding her own fear. "Stay here," she commanded, her voice sharp with an urgency that surprised even herself. She ran towards the front of the house, her wet shoes slipping on the grass, peering through the rain-lashed windows towards the road. It wasn't the pickup. It was a dark sedan, unfamiliar, sleek and somehow menacing in the stormy twilight. A man got out, large and imposing even through the downpour, wearing a long, dark coat that flapped around him like broken wings. He started walking purposefully towards the house, his gaze fixed on it, ignoring the deluge. Panic seized Margaret, cold and sharp. Who was he? Why was he here? Sarah's visceral terror confirmed this was no friendly visit, no concerned neighbor. This felt like a threat. She had to do something, think. Robert, what would Robert do? He wouldn't hesitate. He would protect his own, stand his ground, defend his home. In the storm's quiet aftermath, the world felt washed clean, fragile, yet strangely, profoundly calm. The rain had stopped completely, leaving behind glistening leaves that dripped silver tears onto the saturated earth. The air smelled fresh and earthy, carrying the clean scent of pine needles and damp soil. The sky, bruised and turbulent just moments before, was clearing rapidly to a soft, pearly gray, with patches of pale blue widening and the promise of the returning sun painting. The retreating clouds with hints of rose and gold. Margaret and Sarah stood together in the quiet, transformed garden, the shared crisis, the fear and the defiance, having forged a bond between them stronger, deeper, than any words could have expressed. The sunflower, securely tethered to its stake, stood tall amidst the dampness, its vibrant head lifted towards the brightening sky. A few petals were torn, bruised reminders of the wind's fury, but its sturdy stalk and resilient core remained intact, a testament to its own tenacity and their timely intervention. It was more than just a flower now. It was their shared standard, a symbol of their stand against the storm, against intrusion, against despair. It was proof that life, however fragile, could endure. Margaret looked at Sarah, truly looked at her. The girl's terror had subsided, leaving behind a profound weariness that made her look even smaller, more vulnerable. But the frantic fear in her eyes was gone, replaced by a new depth of quiet trust as she met Margaret's gaze. The silent gesture she had offered, hand outstretched in acknowledgement, in shared victory, lingered in the space between them, an invisible bridge built across silence and pain. "Let's go inside," Margaret said softly, her voice still carrying a trace of the storm's adrenaline, but gentler now. "We need to get dry and warm." Sarah nodded, a simple, trusting movement, and for the first time, without hesitation, she allowed Margaret to gently guide her by the shoulder towards the house. The touch was light, careful, respectful of the girl's boundaries, but Sarah didn't flinch away. She leaned into the guidance almost imperceptibly. It was a small acceptance, a subtle shift in the dynamics between them, but it felt monumental, a threshold crossed. Inside the familiar, slightly musty warmth of the kitchen, Margaret rapped, the shivering girl in one of Robert's old, soft flannel blankets, the faded plaid smelling faintly of cedar from the chest where it was stored. She bustled around the kitchen, her movements purposeful, making hot chocolate from scratch, the way Robert had liked it. The simple domestic task, measuring milk, whisking cocoa, adding a drop of vanilla, felt grounding after the intensity of the storm and the confrontation. It was an act of normalcy, of care, a quiet assertion that life went on, even after chaos. Sarah sat huddled on a kitchen chair, dwarfed by the blanket, watching Margaret's movements with quiet intensity, her bandaged arms tucked inside for warmth. Her dark hair, damp from the rain, clung to her forehead and temples, making her face seem even paler, her eyes larger. As Margaret placed a steaming mug, decorated with cheerful, slightly chipped bluebirds, before the girl, Sarah looked up, her dark eyes searching Margaret's face as if seeking reassurance, confirmation that the danger had truly passed. Then, she did something entirely unexpected, something that spoke volumes about the trust that had been forged in the storm. She reached out slowly, carefully, and began to unwind a portion of the gauze bandage on her left forearm. Underneath the skin was a heartbreaking tapestry of old scars, puckered, discolored tissue, shiny in places, dull in others, the unmistakable permanent legacy of severe burns. But nestled amongst the old healed landscape was a newer, angrier, red mark, clearly a recent injury, a deep scrape, raw and inflamed, likely sustained when she fell during the thunderclap, or perhaps scraped against the rough bark of the maple tree. Sarah pointed a small, trembling finger to the new mark, then looked up at Margaret, her expression a complex mixture of pain, vulnerability, and silent appeal. "Help me." Margaret's nursing instincts, dormant for too long, surged forward, sharp and clear, overriding any hesitation or awkwardness. "Oh, child," she murmured, her voice thick with empathy, pulling up a chair beside the girl. "Let me see." "Does it hurt much?" Sarah nodded mutely, her lower lip caught between her teeth. Margaret gently took the small arm, her touch professional yet infinitely tender, examining the wound. It was a deep scrape, oozing slightly, contaminated by the dirt and rain. It needed cleaning and dressing properly to prevent infection. "All right," Margaret said calmly, her voice regaining the quiet authority, the soothing competence of her nursing days. It felt strangely natural, slipping back into that role of caregiver. "We need to clean this up. It might sting a little, but we have. To get the dirt out, I have supplies." She retrieved her old, well-stocked first aid kit from the hall closet, its contents thankfully still organized and usable. As she worked, gently cleansing the wound with antiseptic wipes, applying a soothing salve, and covering it with a fresh, sterile bandage, she spoke softly, explaining each step in a low, calming murmur. "This is just to clean away any germs. This might feel a bit cold. Almost done now. This nice, clean bandage will keep it safe while it heals." Sarah sat perfectly, still throughout the process, her gaze fixed on Margaret's hands as they moved with practiced care. She winced slightly when the antiseptic stung, her small body tensing for a moment, but she made no sound, endured it with a stoicism that spoke of past pains endured alone. When Margaret was finished, carefully securing the new bandage, Sarah looked down at the clean white square against her scarred skin, then slowly lifted her gaze back to Margaret. A single, large tear escaped her eye and traced a silent path down her cheek. Not a tear of pain, Margaret thought, but of release, of gratitude, of feeling cared for, perhaps for the first time in a long time. Margaret gently wiped the tear away with the pad of her thumb. "There," she said softly, her voice filled with warmth. "All clean. That should feel much better soon." Sarah offered a small, tremulous smile in return, the first genuine, unguarded smile Margaret had ever seen on her face. It transformed her, features softening the wariness, revealing the innocent child hidden beneath the layers of fear and silence. It was like the sun breaking through the storm clouds. Margaret smiled back through her tears, her throat tight, her heart full to bursting. She reached out and gently touched the offered seed, her fingers brushing against Sarah's open palm. No words passed between them. None were needed. The pot? Connection had been made, the silence honored and now broken with intention. It wasn't the end of the story. There would still be hard days. The girl's past remained a shadow, her scars a living testimony. The garden would fade with winter. The house would creak and sigh through cold nights, and grief would still visit from time to time. uninvited. But something had changed. There was now a thread of light woven through the stillness. A small voice had spoken. A seed had grown. A bond had formed, not out of obligation or charity, but out of shared wounds, mutual recognition, and a love that asked nothing, yet gave everything. And in the heart of that once-forgotten garden, under the watchful eye of a red-tailed hawk circling high in the crisp open sky, Margaret and Sarah sat side by side on the worn porch steps, hands dusted with seeds and sunlight. The child was no longer silent, and Margaret was no longer alone. Thanks for spending time with us today. If this story meant something to you, pass it on. This is Still Standing Souls, real stories, quiet strength, lasting hope.